because I actually think a lot of people start from government is good, and therefore it is a bad outcome that we have privatization. And so therefore, even if it is efficient, it's like the real communism has never been tried. It's like, well, if it just was, if we taxed the rich even more and we, funded this better, or then it would work. Progressivism is always high status, like in the last, 150 years. We think of communists as this thing that existed outside the US. And it's like, no, if you actually look at the 20s and 30s, like all of the intellectual circles, like the coolest people in New York, in DC, they're all communists because that was cool. And there is no cool right wing. The right can meme, but they're not cool. The right loses all the time. They get little mini victories, but the war is won by the left. And so if you don't like the direction the left is headed in a macro sense, is build or try to create an alternative that you think can actually win people over without having it tack in a direction you find deplorable. And I think that's possible. I think it requires someone to actually it's a founder, right? Like you need to actually build it. It's like building a religion or a movement, right? So you have the highest concentration of talented people across San Francisco and LA in the country. And they basically, any of the PMCers just basically tack to this extremely dysfunctional set of progressives who run the state. And, they can't build a train. They think algebra is racist. Like all this kind of stuff is a function of, and it's a rational reaction on an individual basis, right? It's like, I just want to get my career, man. Like, I just I want to make money. I want to get the credentials so everyone thinks that I did well. And, I don't want to deal with this epic fight. And so, okay. How do you actually take what Balaji is trying to do and make it retail, make it something that actually people are excited about enough that they will actually follow through on doing some of this stuff? Curtis has written posts about like the app equivalent, which I think Balaji also is talking about, where a politician that had an app that could really organize, like with just 10,000 supporters, actually could have like outsized influence, because getting 10,000 people to show up for anything, like very few politicians even have that ability, and actually get them like on command to do something. We should address that Antonio's not here, huh?
The usual, just if you see him, throw shame at him, get in his DMs. He does break down every other week. He gets enough shame, and he's convinced to take a break from his startup or his kids or whatever else he's doing. And I believe today's Yom Kippur, so he's got
he's now going to start using the endless number of Jewish holidays as an excuse. Every weekend it's going to be some new. Yom Kippur seems pretty legit in terms of high holiday. I mean, you should be the one telling me that, but my sense is like Yom Kippur works, but I feel like the kind of third tier Jewish holidays, probably we should still do the pod, but I don't know. That's for the audience to decide if they really want Antonio to join on a more regular basis.
As a Jew, I'm out here busting my ass, and all the holidays I'm missing. I think Antonio could do the same, but on the day of forgiveness, which is Yom Kippur, I don't entirely forgive him, but I forgive him just a little bit, and we'll see what happens next year. It's also Rosh Hashanah just happened. I'm a terrible Jew, but that's why we have Antonio. We should also address that my background may look familiar to regular Moment of Zen watchers. In the fact that it's your background. I'm here in your casita in Los Angeles, and nice camera.
I've never recorded in the casita. I recorded with the books, right? I have to play the intellectual on the podcast, so I need to virtue signal with the books that I have behind me.
Yeah, I'm in one of Dan's 12 houses, and I have a nice camera. This is the best setup I've ever had.
I mean, to be honest, you do look better than you've looked on a lot of the recent podcasts. So you're the guy promoting SF, right? You're trying to get all your friends to move back. So like, I want to hear your pitch, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, so a lot of the city stuff, right, is fake it till you make it. And so when people say things like, hey, why do we have to, fight about whether SF or New York or Miami or like, why can't every city be great? It's because the reason why we're fighting to promote a certain city is because we want people to move there, because they will only be great if people move there, right? And so, especially if you're trying to dislodge an incumbent, you're not like, the incumbent's great. No, the incumbent sucks, and that's why they need to leave the incumbent and go to your startup or go to your city. And so that's why the city wars have been so sort of like debate oriented, so fight oriented. I think the that what we've found with San Francisco is that San Francisco, I think Twitter is a good analogy to it, which is people can leave and hope that it's dead, but even like a nuclear bomb wouldn't disrupt the network effect that exists. And you can have nice little enclaves, and they can turn out to be their own things, and you've built an awesome one. But and not that you were ever like, hey, let's destroy Twitter, but there were people who were like, Twitter's going to die. You're like, I want to build something new, something different. And on the city side, people are like, San Francisco is going to die. And a bunch of people did move, but it turns out a bunch of people are moving back. And a bunch of people left Twitter up in arms, but it turns out distribution really matters, and you're going to come back if you care about that. And same thing with San Francisco. If you want to be around sort of the smartest people building things, at least in AI or certain spaces, in general, you're going to want to be in San Francisco. And so I'm at a point in my career where I'm still looking to do that. So I came back. And so I regret to inform people that SF is back. I was excited about pursuing something new. I was excited about being something up and coming. But hey, network effects, are a bitch. and you can't destroy them. Yeah, I think what's different is maybe a decade ago, you had to be in San Francisco. Whereas now I think you can have a big company somewhere else. Like I think it's harder, but you can do it. Whereas I think there was a certain time where you really couldn't. But now if you want every edge you can get and you're building a company, you probably want to be in San Francisco. And if you want to be around those people who are thinking about the future in a really exciting way, and I think probably SF has more intellectual culture, where I think just tech has more of an intellectual culture now than it did a decade ago, thanks to some of the people thanks to Peter Thiel, thanks to Balaji, thanks to other people who've just kind of introduced new ideas, and we can get into that in a bit. So if you want to be around people building the future and thinking about the future, you want to be in San Francisco. If you want more diversity than that, if you want arts, fun, nightlife, like other stuff than that, you probably want to be somewhere else. But if you want to really dive in, this is the place to be. How do you react to that?
Yeah, I think it's a great summary. I mean, look, I'm now in LA. Spent almost a decade in San Francisco. The thing I miss the most about San Francisco is it's the highest concentration of ambitious people who want to build new things, and I think generally are interested in ideas. I've never lived in DC, and I've never lived in New York. I've spent a good amount of time in New York, a lot less in DC. But my sense is, I think New York people are tend to like, they like the city and like all the city has to offer. And I don't think anyone realistically is going to ever try to say like, oh, SF itself is a better city than New York. Like, outside of maybe some of the weather, which, SF has bad weather, but at least it doesn't snow. My sense is like, the way to rationalize it is New York is just going to be infinitely more interesting outside of that one specific area. But in terms of like the highest concentration, and it's again, not to say that there aren't people interested in building kind of new things and ideas, the highest concentration of the people who are doing the building plus people interested in ideas, those overlapping circles, that's the Bay Area by far. And SF, I think SF, it's interesting because I think SF just gets used as the term. But obviously, there are plenty of people in the peninsula. Like, if you've got money, you can move down to Palo Alto, Woodside, or any of these places, and it's just like idyllic, right? Like, you don't have any of the homeless issues that you have in San Francisco. It's extremely expensive, and you can tap into basically the entire Bay Area culture. You can zip up to the city for a dinner and be talking to the smartest people in the world about AI, or they could be down in the peninsula. And so, I think Silicon Valley might be the better term. And I know Balaji has kind of said Silicon Valley is now in the cloud, but I think if you just kind of say between San Francisco and San Jose, that corridor still has the highest concentration of ambitious, interesting people. And obviously you have plenty of great examples of people who have moved, right? Like Peter Thiel no longer lives in the Bay Area. I'm sure he has a house there, but he's probably in Miami. He has a place in LA. Keith moved to Miami. I mean, Elon has been out of the Bay Area for before it was cool, right? But my sense is if you just take like, where is the future built? The future is built by the, call it 25 to 35-year-olds who don't have a lot of commitments, and they're just like all in on kind of work. That's Silicon Valley, at least today. The bulk of the YC companies and things like that. And again, you can find the exceptions, both younger and older. But those people, I think, are congregating in SF. At least the ones who are serious about kind of like the biggest and most ambitious ideas. I mean, even just look, like the most interesting new city project is going to be built basically in the Bay Area, the greater Bay Area. And so, like, I think people who want to fight that, go for it. Like, prove the kind of like baseline wrong. But if you're not like on the level of Elon level drive and commitment and just like all in, and you're kind of like socializing, in your parties in New York or Miami, it's just cope. Like, just like there's someone in San Francisco who, because there's actually a lot less, interesting of a social scene and all that, they're just working. Then they're going to outwork you. And that compounding is on the whole and across the number of companies is going to result in the next decacorn, the next $100 billion IPO. And, you can talk about how cool Soho is or Brooklyn, but like what people end up talking about are like the things that get built. So you should just be honest with yourself. I don't know. I've had this conversation with a bunch of folks. It's usually New York people. And I'm trying to say, hey, look, I live in LA. Like, I'm not even trying to defend SF. I'm just saying it's like, I know it's cope being in LA. Like, being in SF definitely is going to be a marginal, and again, Silicon Valley is going to give a marginal benefit to you as a company. And building a company is really hard, and you're looking for any small edge you can get. Maybe there's a version where I should be following what I preach and moving back. I think in my case, like, I don't necessarily need the network effect of SF because I got 10 years of that. And so other people might be able to do that. But if you're earlier in your career and you don't have that yet, trying to do it anywhere else, you're just increasing the difficulty of something that is already extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah, if you've already spent a decade in San Francisco, like you or me or Balaji or Keith or Delian or these other people who've moved, you can continue those relationships in the cloud or come visit a few times a year. But if you're just starting out, and that's why we see so many of the young, ambitious people just moving to San Francisco, because you have to build those relationships in the first place. So that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and then my favorite one is Delian is obviously building a company in California. So like, it turns out like space factories built in Miami is not a thing.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's different from a few years ago is it feels like San Francisco or Silicon Valley is kind of like, or at least Silicon Valley tech has got its confidence back in terms of politics, in terms of standing up for itself. I remember, sort of right after Trump, there was this really air of apology, and there's like tech bro bad, and a lot of like internalized self hatred within tech. And the charitable view is they were taking more responsibility, et cetera, and that led to a lot of people, during COVID being like, hey, why be in a place where people hate you and think that you're not doing good? This was the whole, Mark Zuckerberg put it, then people getting angry at Zuckerberg for donating all the money to the hospital, or also like the Elon, moving sort of Twitter interaction with that sort of government official saying he's done bad for the city. And I think, led by Mike Solana, and Balaji and a few others, I feel like the tide has really turned where tech feels much more confident standing up for itself and feels like it's actually not the bad guy in the city, and maybe Dean Preston is the bad guy. And so it feels like that is exciting to be even adjacent to, or it just creates more of this, hey, I'm not the bad guy here. Actually, I can make a difference and should make a difference. And I have a few friends getting politically involved. We have a few friends getting politically involved who a few years ago would have never done that.
Yeah. I think there's also something, though. It's like once Trump's out of office, you don't have a boogeyman that is just constantly fueling the kind of rage or of the progressive left. So now they're way less effective in terms of bullying the average centrist, because they don't actually it's like Biden is in power. I think in a lot of ways they're pretty embarrassed by a lot of the policies, right? It's like there are these kind of like surface level executive orders, but if you actually look at a lot of the legislation, it's like full of classic pork, kind of wheeling and dealing. And I mean, Biden has been really hard on China, so it's not even like the kind of like xenophobic Trump. It's like, no, Biden has doubled down on that. I think that the only thing that Biden has probably done that is like in the major part of the progressive agenda, outside of like a lot of surface level stuff, because obviously the Supreme Court has actually, I think, done more organizing towards abortion and different cultural war issues, is the border, right? But like, it's a classic example of when I was at Coinbase in 2018, we had a team meeting where it was we shouldn't be working with ICE Immigration Customs and Enforcement for processing Bitcoin that they'd seized for whatever reason. We shouldn't allow them to have an account because they're racist and they were working for Trump. And now with Biden, like they've probably increased just by the number of people coming across the border. They've probably increased the kids in cages. Now they're kids in facilities. But like it just because it's not Trump, so therefore this issue kind of gets like, oh, this is not a major issue we should be focused on.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Compliance doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, with Vanta, it can be super simple. Trusted by over 5,000 fast-growing companies like Chili Piper, Patch, Gusto, and Juniper, Vanta automates the pricey, time-consuming process of prepping for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more. With Vanta, you can save up to 400 hours and 85% of costs. Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customer loyalty. And bonus, our Moment of Zen listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/zen. That's VANTA.com/ZEN.
If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/zen. That's netsuite.com/zen to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/zen.
And so I actually just think the media has a lot less punch in its ability to kind of go after things because they're not going after the Biden administration. And so like people aren't frothed up. And I think they kind of took a lot of shots, during, call it 2017, the Me Too, they had Uber, WeWork. And then when Coinbase came around to go public with Brian Armstrong doing the no politics at work thing, the New York Times fired like 3 front page stories. Coinbase is racist. Coinbase is like, and they didn't stick. I mean, the reporter, Nathaniel Popper, who existed the entire time I was at Coinbase and just like never wrote a positive thing about crypto. He quit. Like he just I lost. So, and Balaji had been talking about this for, a really long time. It's like, we got to beat the journos. But I do think the COVID plus the summer of BLM, I think that the mainstream media lost a lot of the previous punch that it had for that period. And I have to associate a lot of that, though, was with Trump, right? Like Trump was feeding the ability for the media to be something that was relevant. And they were using that power in adjacent categories to kind of like, speak truth to power or whatever. And now if the New York Times writes a story about a tech company, it's like, okay, the founder's just going to say, on Twitter, not even respond to them and go direct. I mean, we saw this week with a completely unrelated individual, but I think it's related to the trend, is Dave Portnoy with this Washington Post story. And I actually don't even care about the details, other than the fact that to think 5 years ago, someone would be recording a call with a journalist, trying to catch them in a trap in terms of getting them to lie and then reading the email that they had said that they didn't send and just posting the video directly. I remember at one point, I think it was like Balaji, or maybe not Balaji, it was someone prominent. They screenshotted a journalist DMing them on Twitter. And there was like a huge brouhaha by the journalist, like, this is violating journalist. Like if a journalist DMs you, you should never leak that on Twitter. As it's like, well, like journalists will take anything stolen and immediately publish it. So I think that the norms have changed, and it's just like you got a lot more hand to the face. And I think, look, Elon with Twitter and Elon's approach to press, right? He got rid of the entire Twitter comms department. And now if you send something to comms or press at Twitter, they just sends a poop emoji back to you. So, or if it's a Washington Post reporter, it's like something about like talk to your handlers or, give my best to Jeff. But the whole point is like that culture is massively changed. And maybe it is because you don't have Trump and Elon is extending the Overton window so far that the marginal CEO can kind of just be like, okay, I'm not as bad as Elon, but at the same time, like I just don't have to engage in the frame, which is kind of crazy because 3 or 4 years ago, people really lived in fear of like, how's the press going to cover this? And like, how am I going to respond?
They can get you fired. They did get people fired, right?
That's the other interesting thing is in a, ZERP world, employees had all these options. So employees can kind of like check the company into like social justice causes because it's kind of like a perk. And it's like a way of leveraging the fact that they had a lot more power, especially if they were talented, over the company. So they could kind of push politics as a way of mood affiliation. And in a world where all of the big tech companies are laying people off and you don't have that BATNA best alternative to the negotiated agreement, right? So it's like a jargon, but you can't just like go land at FANG anymore. And so in that world, I think also employees are kind of looking at this being like, I should actually appreciate my job is a good job and I have stability here. And so I think a lot of just those factors, right? It's like no longer have Trump, Biden's in power. The Elon shift with Twitter significantly changed the online discourse around a lot of this. And then I think ZERP and just the economy, at least in tech, getting hit pretty hard, changes the dynamic.
When you say people at companies could engage in activism because of mood affiliation, just to get a bit more concrete, I think it's a combination of, people want to have a sense that they're making a difference in the world, right? That they're changing the world, that they're on the right side of history, et cetera. There's all this pressure to do that. Like no one wants to admit that they just work at a SaaS company that is not, is not that game changing for the world. And so being able to sort of engage in social justice causes is a way of what they believe doing good in the world. And so there's a certain benefit there. There are certain people who get better jobs because of this type of activism. So there's a natural self-incentive there. But I do think most people were true believers or thought they were true believers. Like I think there's actually very few like really cynical people. And that's how you have kind of these funny, like even the people who were, let's call it transracial, like even the people who pretended to be a different race to either, like I think they actually either believed they were that or believed that they were on the right side of, like I don't think they were just like cynical opportunists or something. Like I think people could actually like convince themselves that they're doing the right thing, even if they're doing something ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't mean to imply that they're cynical. I actually think it's possible, right? Like in a world where you have a lot of options and the economy is really good, you can basically dictate like, this is important to me and I'm going to bring my full self to work and all this other kind of stuff that can exist, right? Google can do it. Facebook can do it. So then other companies cargo cult what the successful companies do, right? And I think in a world where, interest rates are 5%, bring your whole self to work is no longer, a fashionable. Like it's a reversion to the mean.
Totally. And the journalist thing is so interesting. I mean, we talked about David Portnoy. Another person who's done this publicly is Martin Shkreli, right? Anytime a journalist reaches out to him, he's like, I don't talk to any snitch. Like, stop being a snitch. Like, and it's funny how that's stuck up. Michael Malice, sort of a commentator, public intellectual, tweeted a while ago that our work isn't done until journalists have the same reputation as like cigarette salespeople or something. Like, and it feels like their reputation has just took huge nosedive. And some of it's this macro stuff. You mentioned COVID, sort of the Trump stuff, but also a lot of it's the micro stuff, like how they've treated tech and tech just gaining like a political conscience. I mean, I remember a dinner that we had with a few friends before pandemic, and Balaji was like, the New York Times is doing a lot of bad things. And I remember at the time, most of us were like, what? They're amazing. Like, we need them. They're so important. They do such good work.
I think you might have had that opinion. I was a little bit more in the Balaji camp by then, but yeah.
It's very possible.
Put it this way, I was still a subscriber to the New York Times at that point,
Yeah,
because I thought it was important. It was important to read the paper of record.
And it's possible it got worse since then. But Balaji is always early and aggressive and, extra. But he pushes the Overton window. But there was a lot of resistance to him at the time on his anti-journo streak, because it was so totalizing and so aggregate.
Well, I think that there was a lot of fear, right? Like it's one thing to agree with him in private at a dinner, and it's another thing, or in a group chat, which we should talk about that. Like our group chat's dead. That's like a good topic. But I think in a world where journos don't have the same punch that they did, at least in tech, it's like a little bit more hard times, at least because the cost of capital exists, and the big companies that had just been always hiring, it was like a job programs for excess elites, that gravy train has stopped. Yeah, now I think people can talk about this stuff in the open, right? And it's like it's the one of our mutual friends who left the chat group recently. It's just like, what is it? Elon has made it so that we can actually just have the group chat in the open. We don't need to be cowering, with disappearing signal messages.
One thing we talked about last night is, one thing you said that was interesting was, a lot of Silicon Valley people aren't interested in ideas. And that's somewhat in contrast to what I said earlier, but like, how many people are reading kind of these niche, obscure thinkers that have new ideas? And one thing you said is, like, a lot of people are like where you were 5 years ago. So instead of like calling specific people out, perhaps I could ask you to maybe reflect on the difference between sort of where you are now and where you were 5 years ago. Like, what do you, just in the world of ideas or having a mental model for understanding the world, like, how would you sort of explain the gap there? Because I think a lot of people are where you were 5 years ago, but curious.
Yeah, and I think we had talked about this in a previous episode, but my own journey was kind of have a very rudimentary set of political beliefs, kind of almost like cartoonish in some ways, of maybe starting more conservative, getting more liberal in college. And then look, I graduated college and I worked at the like most PMC of PM. I was a management consultant, right? Like a 23-year-old who knows nothing about business, yet is getting rented out to Fortune 500 companies at an extremely high rate, most of which they didn't pay me, but that's fine. I'm doing the economic trade there of experience. And I'm just in the Borg, man. Like, so now I don't have like a ton of time to like be questioning this. It's just like, I'm trying to like make it in my career. So you kind of grind for 3 years, working, suppress, kind of like no independent thought, just like try to keep moving up the video game here of the career. Moved to Silicon Valley, which I think that was a little bit more contrarian relative to my peers, at least, right? A lot of them were going to go to business school. And my thinking was, it's like, look, I want to work in tech. I want to work at a high growth startup. I want to take risk. And if that works out, there's a lot of upside, both from a career trajectory standpoint and an economic. Worked at a startup, ended up getting excited about Bitcoin, joined Coinbase. For the first 3 years of Coinbase, basically thought it was like, I can't believe I joined this startup that's not going anywhere. For some combination of reasons, stuck it out. And then in 2017, we went from 10 million in revenue to $1 billion in revenue. And all of a sudden, like, Coinbase was like a real company, had a 90% correction the next year. So that, choppy road, but I'm not spending any time thinking about like the political origins of wokeness. Like, that's just not, I didn't even know what wokeness was. To kind of like think about this now, 2014, Ferguson, right? I was like kind of aware of it. And like, I'm sure it trickled into Twitter, but Twitter wasn't even the same game as now. And I probably just was like, oh, that's unfortunate that this young black man was killed by these police officers. I don't even know the details. Just to think now that like, I can tell you that the Eric Holder DOJ report, which is something like 80 pages or 90 pages, finishes with the one-line statement of, we do not believe there are any criminal charges to press at this time. Like, whereas if you were to ask the average person what injustice was done in Ferguson, they would give you whatever the media had told them. When the reality is the Obama DOJ with it, I want to say he was the first African-American, or I guess black, attorney general, couldn't find a single thing to prosecute anyone on from a federal standpoint, when this is supposed to be this huge egregious, so like, narrative violation. But I wasn't aware of any of that. And so I think it was only when I left Coinbase 2019, finally had some time, fortunately got a chance to know Balaji a little bit at Coinbase, and you get introduced to this person, and then it just kind of goes fractal from there. And then I think COVID really accelerated it, where now all of a sudden people weren't doing, any in person. So the chat group phenomenon of COVID, I think, really, really blew up. And obviously, the same time, it's like peak Trump. So there is no one talking anything outside the kind of like very limited Overton window of Trump bad, everything bad in the world as a result of Trump. Like, how could you even be talking about a different topic other than the Trump? And so I think I was fortunate in the sense that I had a lot of time during a period where I think there was just a lot of call it dark social, in the sense that you would never be able to see this from a Google standpoint. And I think that was also the rise of Substack, right? Like, you had all these people start jumping on Substack. Substack's making it easy for these people to be, have a living, whether you were on the right side of the political spectrum or the left side, right? It's like the fact that like Matty Iglesias was a co-founder of Vox, I'm pretty sure, and is now, one of the bigger Substacks, Noah Smith. So I think like during a period when I had a lot more time, I got exposed to a lot of this stuff. But I think going back to something we were saying last night, I think one of the things that's really hard about this is A, most people just don't have time. And then B, there is no map. And I know Balaji's talked about like cloud cartography as like a thing, right? Like, where in terms of when you actually have a map of a nation state, it starts to create the idea like, oh, these arbitrary set of lines inside that is what the country of America, US or France is. And so his idea of like, okay, if you can start mapping these network states, or you can map within the Great Tribe in San Francisco, you can start to actually manifest power, right? Physical space is correlated with that. And I think the map of ideas, it just doesn't exist, right? And it's like, okay, where do I even start? Like, how do I want even, if I want to have a good survey of like, what are the kind of like interesting intellectual ideas that have bubbled up in the last 10 years? There's no website to go search for that. Like, so you have to start to get a sense of the history, which that requires a lot of work. And then B, you have to actually have someone who's already synthesized a lot of this. And so I think we're fortunate that we have a few friends who really went deep on this and became like almost like a little bit of like a guru, in the sense of, hey, what about this? Oh, you should read this, this, and this, or investigate this, or read this blog post, or check out this person, or listen to this podcast. And I think one thing that's worked well for us with Moment of Zen is a lot of that exposure. You and I both got in AGM, same thing, and I think AGM actually had a lot of pre-existing. It's one of the many reasons the AGM is very interesting is he just pulls these things out of thin air. It's like, where did you have that? He's like, oh, I was a grad student backpacking through India, and I had a lot of time on my hands. The interesting thing is like, I would have never discovered Tom Holland. Like, I like history, but like I probably would have just steered away from. It's like I went to Catholic school. I'm like, why would I want to read a book on the history of Christianity? And now it's like, I think one of the most important books I've read in my entire life. Who is putting that blueprint together? I mean, Slate Star Codex is actually probably the closest thing to someone, not necessarily that specific set of ideas, but is kind of like a curator of like, here are some interesting things. I think he was, Scott Alexander was early to, I think, EA. A lot of the East Bay intellectual culture and SF intellectual culture exposed through that blog. But yeah, I'd be curious how you think about it.
What I like about the Tom Holland example is that it's like a mental model update, which is, okay, you read that and you're like, okay, I can see sort of the origins or the comparisons between Christianity and sort of far left progressivism. You could see how there's like a continuation of ideas there. You could see sort of the sort of moral innovations that Christianity has introduced, whether it's sort of the sort of care for the victim, the first shall be last shall be first, the meek shall inherit the earth, and justice being served in that way. And that's sort of this great moral inversion from what happened before, which was the strong or master morality, et cetera. Also sort of the introduction of individuality in that sense, and that I am the interpreter of God. And you can see a tie there to, hey, I'm the interpreter of what is the good life. Once we got rid of God, we still kept this sort of like, really strong sense of the individual. And there's a number of different books that just serve as like a mental model update. And I think one other one is this idea of the Borg, as which some people call it the cathedral. Eric Weinstein calls the gated industrial complex or something. But this, Jacob Siegel will have on an episode. He had a great piece in Tablet around it, But this idea that there is this collaboration between government, media, and education, and also Fortune 500, and that they coordinate to achieve things that they couldn't achieve sort of democratically or without coordination, and that it also tends to be sort of run in only one direction, i.e., the left tends to have most of the mind share in those organizations in positions of power, and thus they can. We saw this very publicly with the Twitter files, where Twitter is coordinating with the government on behalf of the DNC. But there's many other examples, both obvious and subtle. And what's challenging there is when you talk about it, it makes you sound like Alex Jones or something. It makes you sound like, oh, there's this conspiracy. There's this massive conspiracy. Even though Balaji likes to point out this great Time article of how there was this centralized, there was this conspiracy to defeat Trump, i.e. there was an attempt by a group of people to work together to make sure that Trump wasn't elected. And they achieved, just like there were people on Trump's side that were trying to make sure that he was elected. Like, people are very quick to disrupt or sort of assume that any sort of conspiracy is just a crackpot idea. And that's because the right is often assuming these, crackpot ideas are true, that there's these sex trafficking rings and all this kind of crazy stuff, although, Epstein in fact was. But I think the biggest mental challenge people have is not understanding the concept of emergent collusion. This idea that just because something isn't centralized or just because something isn't coordinated doesn't mean that it's not happening. And the genius of this sort of, collaboration is that it tends to happen in a somewhat decentralized way, in that even if you replaced some of the people, the incentives and the institutions are just set up that if you replace them with new people, you would still have the same sort of collusion, this sort of minority collusion deciding on behalf of the majority what should be done. We saw this a lot in COVID, and you see people defend that as democracy, right? Like, that's democracy. It's like Washington Post. What are they doing? They defend democracy. If you attack Washington Post, you're attacking democracy. If you democratically elect, social media, even though that's the voice of the masses, that's a threat to democracy. Masses electing this candidate that people don't like, even though it's democratically run, that is a threat to democracy. And of course, they'll find certain things where they one side will sort of challenge the norms, certain democratic norms, i.e. January 6th, which was ridiculous and stupid. But in general, I think one of Balaji's great insights is actually what democracy means to these people is when they win, when their party wins, or what journalism means to these people is when they do it. When other people do it, it's not journalism.
You dox, I report.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is one of Curtis's simple truths that he utters, and then you can't unhear it, is the term democracy. I say that word to you, positive connotation. You get very civic. You're thinking about the flag, our strong institutions. If I say the word politics, negative connotation, conniving, lying, manipulation. It's the same thing, right? Like politics is democracy. Like that's what we have, right? Like if we had a monarchy, there are no politics, right? Because politics come from the monarch basically gets to decide everything. And so our process is messy. That is democracy. And so I just find that interesting. And then, of course, if I have to give one person for shattering the Truman Show of like how I think I viewed everything, and to your point, I actually think it's a very important one. You run the risk of basically sounding like Alex Jones or like one of these people who are just so outside the normal Overton window. It's just super easy for the Borg to basically ostracize, label, you're a racist, you're a whatever ist, like that they can just hit you with. And then another point that Balaji's brought up in the past is they attack your social supply chain. What they tried to do to Dave Portnoy, right? It's just like go after the advertisers because Dave Portnoy doesn't care what your point of view is. But if you can use your platform to attack the centrist / apolitical company that just like, hey, I wanted to just advertise at a pizza fest, right? Like I sell a home pizza oven, and now like, whoa, like I don't want to step in this like political mess. I'm going to back off. That's the power. And Balaji had the presentation in 2018 where he's talking about social supply chain. I'm like, Balaji, what are you talking about? But it's so true. Like, that is how they attack. They attack through advertisers and sponsors. I mean, look what's happening to Elon, right? The Anti-Defamation League is going after Elon. Whether you believe Elon or not, like, we should just say, it's like, do we think that actually the amount of anti-Semitic material on Twitter has increased or decreased? Probably something that's pretty measurable. But you know that it's just like the ADL is just doing it strictly from a Elon bad, Rocket Man bad. So therefore, we're just going to take this position, and it's had a material impact on the advertising. So for me, exposure to Curtis is eye-opening in the sense that he takes very basic concepts that you hold as constants since you've been a kid growing up within the kind of, call it, American education system, and just has you question them from first principles, right? It's like, are we actually run by a democracy, or are we run by an oligarchy? You know, like in a democracy, like, and just kind of working through some of these things. Even if you don't agree with them, it's just actually a useful exercise to be like, I should actually approach every one of these assumptions on how the world works from a first principles basis and try to deeply understand. It's like, does this mechanism as advertised work as advertised, or does it actually work in a different way? Like, the fact that basically Harvard and Yale, there are no dissenting opinions between these universities, like they all have the same set of opinions, that one you just can't unhear. And so I think it's unfortunate because Curtis, whether he's thinking he's being funny or whatever, he intentionally or unintentionally just creates this pariah status for centrists to be able to even publicly talk about them. I think we're in an environment now where it's like, imagine talking about Curtis in 2020 or Moldbug, like, people, you had just been canceled. You'd be like, you're a Nazi. Like, okay. But my point is that I think what's exciting is we're finally back in an era where I don't think it's as mainstream, but you can actually have open discussions about issues and be truth-seeking. And in that way, I think one of the appeals of MOZ is we're willing to actually do that, right? Like, we had a discussion about IQ that, again, I think in an environment where people are just looking for reasons to cancel, they could just snip one sentence or mash two things together and then try to cancel. Versus if you listen to that conversation, I think we did an okay job of articulating. It's like, there's actually a really respected Harvard geneticist in David Reich who's writing an op-ed at the New York Times saying, hey, this is an issue, we should be dealing with this. And, you know, Ezra Klein, a preeminent thinker on the left, is actually having a robust discussion with Sam Harris about Charles Murray. Like, the fact that most people don't even know that stuff is happening is a result of just kind of like a mainstream media monoculture, and it's just like they're not gonna cover any of this stuff. So I don't know. I feel like we deviated from the original point.
Well, let me just, on that point, I mean, Freddie DeBoer and Catherine Page Hardin are two leftist intellectuals who've also written about the importance of understanding IQ and differences in IQ between peoples. They take a redistributionist approach to it, which is, hey, if we can identify that people have IQs, if we can realize and appreciate that not everyone has the same potential, right? It's not just a matter of working hard, which is what the right says, or it's not just a matter of sort of quick interventions with putting more money into it. Like, they say, hey, outcomes are going to be different, and we need to sort of plan for that. And because we're not planning for that, not able to change it. Let me start over. I guess what I'm trying to say is that even on the left, you have people who are talking about some of these topics, even if they have different goals, but they're realizing that the truth is going to help them better achieve their goals, as opposed to masquerading something because you can't actually address what the problem is. So when a group likes to say, hey, since civil rights to now, we've tried to make outcomes more equal. And guess what? We haven't really done that, right?
Well, they've gotten less equal.
Yeah, exactly. And so there should be a performance review. Like, think about all the trillions of dollars meant to equalize outcomes across education, housing, just all of these different projects. How have they done? Like, what assumptions were they created under? Are those assumptions still true? It's not just more and more and more, right? And so
I give a lot of credit to Substack, though, because obviously this stuff existed from a technology standpoint. Newsletters are not new. Blogs obviously existed prior to that. But I think that there's something powerful about long form delivered to you in a push way. I think prior, like if you go to MailChimp, it was kind of more designed for like e-commerce or like a monthly update versus the idea to just hop into Substack and then be able to just write out a missive and then fire it off to people. And I know some of these things are subtle, but just like having used Substack enough times, it feels much closer to Twitter for long form than it does, a traditional tool. And then obviously the fact that you could monetize it. And then they got a little bit of a halo because I think that it's like to have a Substack indicated that you were an intellectual, right? You could do the same thing on Ghost, but you just look like a nerd versus a Substack, and having the Substack domain actually kind of added some amount of credibility, even though obviously Substack lets anyone do whatever they want basically on the platform. And so I think that is a important thing in terms of the zeitgeist because, and obviously things have changed a little bit since Elon's taken over Twitter. He's hurt links even more than Twitter was doing before. And so I think that has actually probably shifted it a little bit. And then obviously Twitter has long tweets. And the fact that you've fragmented, right? Like you have removed a bunch of intellectual, granted, most of them tend to be more journalist or left-leaning. You have moved a bunch of those folks off Twitter, even if they're quietly obsessed about checking it so that they can screenshot and then post on Threads or Mastodon or whatever they're using. But my sense is Substack is an important piece of all of this because you have the Noah Smiths and Maddie Iglesias on the world, and then Richard Hananias and Curtis Yarvin on the right, like, and everyone in between can do a Substack. It's like a culture of letters in the sense that like there's almost this aspect of there was an intellectual culture of writing letters through the Enlightenment and until kind of the 20th century, and so I think that has a vibe to it, and I think that there's also like the kind of response culture that also exists, which Curtis will talk about. That used to be a thing with blogging where he has actually a technical like term where basically you take a blog post and you go paragraph by paragraph and then you respond. And he's done this a couple of times actually to Substacks on other Substacks. I think Noah Smith actually being one of them. Ignore the like points or who was right or wrong. It's just like actually a very rich intellectual culture where you see someone trying to systematically address every single point in someone else's missive. And then they have plenty of space to be able to link and kind of make citations and things like that. And so I think it's just a very rich intellectual culture that as a result of that. And then again, it goes back to this idea that it's like if you're not subscribed to those things, or you're not following that group of people on Twitter and having them go back and forth or in the group chats, then you probably just don't see it, right? Because the New York Times is downstream of the stuff that's happening at Substacks.
I want to actually walk through what we think, and I have a few to throw out, are some of Curtis's big ideas, big intellectual contributions, kind of mental model updates that, of course, people don't have to agree with any or all, and we certainly don't, but just cause you to reevaluate your sort of mental models, and if only to more confirm them with more conviction, help you evaluate them from first principles. We talked about one, which is the idea of the cathedral. And you alluded to another or adjacent one, which is the idea of like, do we live in a democracy or do we live in an oligarchy? And you would imagine if you said we're primarily a democracy, that you would look at the things that the government does, and you would say, you could ask, hey, did I vote for that? Did I vote for the war in Iraq? Did I vote to spend all this money, money printing that happened during COVID? Did I vote for lockdowns? Did I vote for whatever policies you want or don't want? Like, how many of them are actually democratically run? But then also there's also this idea of people tend to think that the options are democracy or monarchy, but it's also like, how many of these people can actually be fired? Whether Trump wins or Biden wins, like how many of them are either accountable to either an electorate, like they can be voted on, or just run by, can be fired by a CEO in the same way a company is. And we tend to have this model that there are Democrats and there are Republicans. And if Democrats win, they get to be in charge. And if Republicans win, they get to be in charge. And that's why the stakes are so high. And this idea of the administrative state or the deep state or or sort of this oligarchy that we're alluding to, is sort of this permanent government class that sits above whoever is president, and it doesn't work in the same way of a CEO. And so tech people don't understand this because if someone or don't intuitively understand this, because if someone's CEO of Apple or CEO of, enter whatever company, you can fire whole swaths of organizations. We just saw it with Twitter, right? Elon comes in, fires 75% of the team, rearranges the whole organization within weeks, within months. It's a whole new org. And you can't do that in government. It's almost like Curtis calls it. It's almost like being the Queen of England or something. It's like a more ceremonial. Of course, there are big things that the president can do, but that was one big mental update to me. The idea that, hey, it's not actually being CEO of a company. It's not even close in terms of the actual power.
I would say that the administrative state concept, which is related to the cathedral, but actually is more about the idea that the president doesn't actually have executive control over the executive branch. And I think a lot of people would just be like, well, that's not true. But if you actually get into the nitty gritty, it's like, I think it's like the General Services Act or the government, like there's a set of rules that apply to government employees that are working towards a federal government pension that, so you have this appointed class on top of every federal, like executive branch agency, right? Like the Treasury, you appoint the Treasury Secretary and the people at the top, and they're confirmed by the Senate. And then there's a bunch of just permanent employees who are there. The simple observation, as you point out, is just like, imagine Tim Cook or Elon with Twitter. But Twitter is not like a well-run company. So let's take Apple, which I think most people would say, yeah, that's a well-run company. It's like they're the most valuable company in the world. Just imagine a world where Tim Cook couldn't just like say, no, like this group of people is fired or reassigned or do whatever. It's just like you have to go through some process. That doesn't seem like it's like very executive, right? And so I think Curtis's observation in a meandering way or directly that Congress is in charge of the government for the most part, put the Supreme Court to the side because it's kind of like a weird thing, but like fundamentally Congress kind of dictates how the president is able to operate. And Congress, the like reelection rate is super high. I don't know, something like 80% or like, so basically it's the same, it's a gerontocracy. It's the same group of people that are professional politicians. It just, there's no dynamic component to it, right? It's just like, you're not attracting the best and brightest from the country. It's you get all these people that build up power over time. I like the state of, I don't know, Illinois or Louisiana, but like, should a small town congressperson end up being the Speaker of the House and then wield like massive amounts of power over the country? Like, it's like, no, I didn't elect that person, but like that's how Congress works, and it's very tenure based. I think Curtis is also just like the simple monarchy versus democracy versus oligarchy. Prior to Curtis, if you had told me he is like, I'm a monarchist, or like I think we should have a monarchy, I would have been like, okay, that like, we got rid of the monarchy in 1776, and we're not back there since. And I think there were 2 points. It's like, one, what is the organizational structure for the most well-run organizations in the world? So pick your favorite organization that you think is the most competent and like effective at achieving outcomes that they set out to do. Almost certainly is a monarch who has a board, which is elected. So you actually do have a structure where shareholders, now a lot of times, obviously the monarch is the founder and they have it, but in the case of Apple, Tim Cook is not, he doesn't have outsized control. He is working on behalf of shareholders who elect a board, who then decide to hire Tim Cook. So there's actually a more sophisticated monarchical structure there. And then I think that the second thing that I think Curtis points out is, if you actually look at the most effective and powerful president probably in history, and you can argue this, but FDR, his obsession with that period of like the pre-FDR period and the post-FDR period and like how the world changed, like prior to even just getting exposed to that, I would have just been like, FDR is like snooze fest. Like, I have no interest in learning about FDR, but it's just like the amount of stuff that FDR just like created and now we just take for granted in a pretty strongman and aggressive way, right? He threatened to pack the Supreme Court. Like he did a lot of things to just push through his set of policies in the first 100 days. And then he broke the norm. He was on his 4th term. And they like, he basically was he was a Caesar. He had just taken over. If he hadn't died, he would have run for a 5th term and people would have been fine, right? Like, because
what about democracy? He threatened democracy.
Right. And so it's so frustrating because you just can't talk about Curtis in a way with I think reasonable people or any people on the left, because then you're going to get canceled or people are just going to accuse you of being a Nazi or whatever. But the fact that he has actually broken down a lot of this, and look, a lot of this comes from Burnham, a lot of this comes from Machiavelli. Like there are influences on Curtis. It's not like he just came up with it. But in terms of his frame and unqualified reservations, doing it as kind of pseudonymous blogger 15 years ago, I think it's just really fascinating because it forces you to say, okay, like, how do I arrive at an independent set of beliefs about how the world works, and not just take everything that I learned in American history class as a given. And so I think, I think that's the thing that I'm most interested in from Curtis is reframing a lot of like assumptions and actually forcing me. It's increased my interest to go more first principles into understanding how the world works and not have to rely on, because I read it in a history book, or this is the conventional wisdom, or this is like, you should just arrive at a model for the world, assuming you want to do the work and that's of interest to you, that is rooted in more sources and you should be able to construct things or validate, like, do I agree with this or not? And so that's the meta point that I think is the most interesting about Curtis, because he feels like he's someone who went from one point of view and really radically opened it up. And so I think that's what I find the most interesting versus some of the more, call it neo-reactionary, or things to kind of just sound good on a podcast. Like that's less interesting to me.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing about him is that if you're a nice person with nice sensibilities, he's basically unreadable because he's too big of a troll. He makes all these kind of inside references, like you really have to struggle to read him. Even though some of the ideas are quite good, it's almost like better to read the translators because you end up conflating the tone with the ideas, the unlikability of the tone with sort of the unlikability of the ideas. And I remember in college, like I was reading all this stuff around how privatization was the enemy and I was like, okay, democracy, good. The private sphere, it's not democracy, so it's bad. But when things are in the public sphere, they run like the DMV, right? And so we're glad that we have SpaceX. We're glad that we have Anduril. We're glad that we have these sort of privatized services, companies that have the pressures of a private company where there's sort of Darwinian selection. The best companies provide the best services and win out, and the worst ones fail. Whereas in the public sector, there's just no accountability in that same way.
But let me push back on that. I actually think that is not an assumption you can make for everyone, because I actually think a lot of people start from government is good, and therefore it is a bad outcome that we have private anything or privatization. And so therefore, even if it is efficient, it's like the real communism has never been tried. It's like, well, if it just was, if we taxed the rich even more and we funded this better, or then it would work. Like it's just every time it's always an excuse of, oh, well, we haven't really tried the government run version of this. And and in Sweden, it works really well, right? It's like an ethno state. I think that frame is important, because I think a lot of people start from the frame of government is good. I want the government to get wins because it's a collective win. And whatever that's rooted in, jealousy of some really rich person being successful, the fact that it generally is, I think Democrats are like pro-government and Republicans are anti-government. So it's like you pick the personalities that you kind of want to have the mood affiliation with. The fact that most folks can't have a rational discussion of, does the private sector work more effectively than the public sector, just from an unemotional, like, let's look at the data. Like Noah Smith, I think, is actually quite good at this, right? Like he would look at it. He might try to spin it in a little bit more of a left-leaning way, because that's where his sympathies lies, but he's going to look at the data and he's going to give his opinion based on kind of the evidence, right? So I think that's the challenge. Is Curtis is so far on the offensive of the sensibilities, and this goes back to actually why do people not care about this stuff, or like why don't they want to engage with it? It goes back to the social supply chain. So I start talking about Curtis at work, Now someone accuses me of being, I don't know, misogynist, racist, whatever, because he's Curtis. And now I get fired. But it's like, wait, that's not helping me achieve my professional goals. It's not helping me provide for my family. So I'm probably just not going to talk about Curtis. Like I'm not going to bring my full self to work, right? And so I think that is it has a natural kind of dampening influence on people's willingness to kind of go outside the box, because it's like, no, there are actual consequences here. Becoming more radical in a PMC driven like world of, kind of like following the norm. Hey, be really good employee, focus on moving your career trajectory up, get little unlock achievements in terms of titles and compensation. Like, you probably don't want to be talking about kind of too many new ideas, because those new ideas might get you fired, because your boss doesn't want to deal with that, because they don't, the other boss doesn't want to deal with it, because they don't want the advertisers to stop, advertising. And so I think the social supply chain is I think that's Balaji's most interesting idea. And I don't know, maybe he got it from somewhere else. So that was the first time I heard it. And I think if you model the social supply chain as the reason that ideas are less in vogue, because in a networked world, like, you can get canceled really fast, even in a quote post-cancel world, like, there can be a lot of pressure put on you pretty quickly by a set of people if you are too outspoken.
Remember when Balaji gave that presentation to us at Jack Altman's house in like 2018, 2019? I wish he publicized it, but do you remember what the main points were? I think he sort of predicted that there was going to be a massive, like, almost civil war within tech or something, or that the far left would put so much pressure on the centrists to become left, especially as we were ending sort of like a Trump.
He's tried to make his points, and I think, like, I've known him long enough that I give him the benefit of the doubt of trying to say, like, okay, I understand you're trying to workshop something, but it's like, I think you got a lot of heat on one where it was like woke capital, tech capital, and then it's like the CCP or whatever. And he was like putting the CCP above woke, and then it's like you have other people within tech being like, I don't like woke people, but like I'm still pro-American. And so I think that gets like muddled, and it's like a distraction from what his point of basically which he's been early on, is the set of institutions. And so Balaji is interesting in the sense that I think he's more of an applied version of Curtis, right? Like, Balaji is a kind of a lot more in the arena, trying to build stuff, trying things, learning. But I think, like, Balaji is there are elements to what Curtis is saying, but Balaji is trying to kind of codify it in terms of like a little bit more concrete. It's not 100% right. It's like, I think network state still is abstract, although, I think they're making progress towards or manifesting it. Yeah, I think there's just like a range of people. And like, Curtis obviously has had an influence on Peter Thiel. Right. There was a whole big thing recently in the last few years where they tried to cancel everyone who had ever like emailed with Curtis. Like, and it was like, Balaji knows Curtis and Peter Thiel knows Curtis. And like, therefore, like, this is a cabal of just, deplorable people that we should try to just cancel. And that didn't end up working. I mean, Curtis obviously went by a pseudonym for a really long time, and then he got doxxed himself.
Peter Thiel and David Sachs wrote this book in 1995 called Diversity Myth, which stands up 30 years later, or it reads so prescient, where they talked about sort of the campus activism that they were seeing in the 90s at Stanford. It was called multiculturalism at the time. And what they said was basically, hey, there's sort of this group of thinkers and school of thought that claims to be about celebrating other cultures, but really what it's doing is being anti-Western culture, or anti our own culture, or anti our own people.
Yeah, we talked about this with Solana, right?
Yeah. Curtis, of course, did found Urbit, so he has some, skin in the game as an entrepreneur. Balaji, of course, has a much more fleshed out sort of operating experience. But I think what's interesting is that Balaji is also in the arena more as a thinker too, because by design. Like, Curtis is really into this thing that he calls the clear pill that he wrote about in a blog post a few years ago, which is this idea that if you're fighting against another side and you don't have a chance of winning, you're actually emboldening that side. And this is why he said in 2020, and people thought he was crazy, which is like, if you want what Trump wants, you actually don't want Trump to win. You want Biden to win, which sounds counterintuitive. It's like winning by losing. And his argument was basically like, look at the power like that Trump's enemies have had since he took office. And Curtis says something very simple, which is, I want my president to help my friends and hurt my enemies. That's how I think about, yes, that's the thing about politics, right? It's sort of Machiavellian. And he says what Trump has done is he's, grown New York Times by a factor of 2, ACLU by a factor of 10. The left is stronger than ever. It's, sort of taking over all these institutions under sort of this boogeyman threat that you mentioned earlier. And Trump, even though, despite his best efforts, whatever, despite him wanting it to be different, he is in fact enraging them further. And so he calls it like the pull the chair move in basketball. You have to retreat. If you can't find a way to win, you have to not fight. Because if you fight, you just make them stronger. You're sort of this controlled opposition. You're David Brooks, the New York Times, or whatever. You're this. You provide the semblance of like an equal game or a fair game. You're just giving your enemies more power.
Well, just look at what happened with Dobbs. So the Republicans supposed to have this red wave, and the Supreme Court gives this gift to the Democrats of just like, we're going to make abortion illegal, it's a question for the states, and so now you have all this stuff, and then they're able to just like beat back in every single, Kansas has some prop election, abortion, kind of like pro-abortion wins, and just like. So by virtue of just like giving people these culture war issues, they become rallying points, right? And Trump is the ultimate in terms of just like driving people to want to watch CNN and MSNBC and read the New York Times and things like that.
So Curtis is advocating for this clear pill, but Balaji says, fuck that. I don't want to sit on the sidelines and just lose. And so let's exit. Let's fight via other means, right? Or let's agree and amplify. Like he has all these sorts of phrases for things. And I think one reason I'm really excited for Balaji is that I think the Gray Tribe is a sort of symbiosis of a bunch of his different ideas, right? He says you can't just exit, you need voice and loyalty. And the Gray Tribe is a synthesis of his ideas around being pro-technology, creating a pro-tech movement, but not being anti-American or not just conceding these institutions that have so much power and so much importance over our lives. Like he's someone who will leave, but most people are not going to leave the United States. Most people are not going to leave San Francisco. Most people are not going to leave, and so I think that idea has much more appeal than his previous ideas. Obviously, the Bitcoin bet was a big failure, not just practically, but ideologically in terms of people just not liking this sort of what they see as this anti-American sentiment, this post-American sentiment. I think we still love America. And even if it's flawed, it's fucking up, it's being taken over, we want to improve it. We want to get it on the right path. And so he's in the arena in that sense as well. And I think this is a big evolution for him, and I think it's going to be great.
Well, so to address the Curtis clear pill, I think it's too nihilist. So I agree with Balaji. I think that there's some truth there, though, in the sense that it's, Lenin heightened the contradictions, just let it get so bad so that then people are going to be looking for a savior. So it's like, if you actually want SF to like change, you should not be trying to fix it now. You should be letting them drive it into even a worse situation, 10x worse. And then it's like Gotham and you need Batman or like it's a complete turnaround. And I think there's some truth to that in the sense that it goes back to this idea that the average person just doesn't care about this stuff because they're focused on their career, they're focused for providing for their family, and like getting involved in any of this too radical thinking or politics is not good for their career. And so most people won't actually do it. Or it's like they'd rather watch Netflix, or like it's just like there are too many fun things to go do or interesting things to do. And it's like, why am I going to waste my time like organizing a political party that is like trying to find a third way outside of, the traditional left and right. I see actual truth in both, in the sense that I think from a stated preference of like how I feel, and it's just like, I don't care if there's no shot at doing this. It's like, we must try. And so I think that the idea of like making an effort and trying the best thing and then iterating, that's entrepreneurial, that's Silicon Valley. But I think from a real preference is most people don't care. And they're just like, I actually don't want to download the culture war every week. Like I see this, we joke about this. It's like we go to dinner last night and, some of the people at the dinner, it's just, I don't think that they actually want a full download of what happened on the internet that day. And it's just like, what very online person in a very small circle of people on Twitter, is getting canceled or trying to cancel, or it's like someone retweeted and then quote tweeted and then blocked this person. And it's just like the gossip of the town square for most people is actually kind of pretty boring. And they're just like, I'd rather occupy my brain with the latest Netflix show and like my kids. And I think that that's admirable, right? Like, it's just like, you don't have an interest in this. But so I think that the thing that I would say is, how do you actually take what Balaji is trying to do and make it retail, make it something that actually people are excited about enough that they will actually follow through on doing some of this stuff? And I think Balaji has ideas. Curtis has written posts about like the app equivalent, which I think Balaji also is talking about, where a politician that had an app that could really organize, like with just 10,000 supporters, actually could have like outsized influence, because getting 10,000 people to show up for anything, like very few politicians even have that ability, and actually get them like on command to do something. That's actually part of Trump's power, is Trump really can actually draw crowds. So yeah, I think that that's the challenge, is like, and it goes back to Curtis has good ideas, bad UI. How do you package the stuff that's coming from Curtis, the stuff that's coming from Balaji, other thinkers? They don't necessarily have to be on the right. It could be, the Noah Smiths of the world. How do you package it in a way that it's retail, that actually gets people to care? And like, I think a great example of this is near and dear to my heart, is my wife is working in nuclear energy. And that should just be a non-controversial, down the fairway, like, we should have energy independence. Okay, Republicans are excited. We should have no carbon energy. Democrats are excited, right? Like Green New Deal, baby. Yeah, like, so let's build nuclear. And it's like, well, actually, it's like the Sierra Club still doesn't like nuclear because they're funding, whether it's from the kind of like oil companies, which don't obviously want to replace natural gas as the baseload power. They don't want nuclear. And then your classic example of an administrative state failure, the NRC, which has been in existence since 3 Mile Island and has approved 0 new reactor sites and or reactor types for the most part. And they just approved some new design for something. But in 50 years, there's been no new nuclear in the United States. It was just pre-existing projects got continued. And then there's one very expensive over cost project in Georgia that was already at an existing nuclear plant. Whereas like an alternative version of the world is, we just build nuclear, and it's like, great, we can suck all the carbon out of the atmosphere. We can desalinate all the water. Like, this is like a very Mike Solana, like, EAC kind of like, fuck yeah, like, let's 10x the amount of energy, 100,000x the amount of energy that we have, and just like geoengineer the shit out of everything and solve climate change. And it like turns out it's like, actually most people on the left really don't care about the climate change. They care about the control of the economy and the mood affiliation. And the people on the right are kind of like, yeah, well, I make a lot of money from natural gas now, and like I actually want to increase the amount of so it's just like kind of this Borg of a system that then blocks the construction of the nuclear.
It's fascinating. It makes me think of another thing Balaji once told me, this idea of like, it's very natural. I was a person who said, hey, why doesn't Bezos give more money? Why doesn't Elon give more money? Why don't these companies do more for social good? Like, if you think about all the problems in the world, like, why aren't they doing more? And what Balaji says is like, hey, why is all reporting on like why Apple and Amazon and all these people are bad, or not doing good work, and their organizations are failing to provide, and all this stuff, sort of like almost oppositional research against corporations, but there isn't that same diligence or research or espionage, whatever you want to call it, against actually like government organizations themselves. Or he says, hey, Bezos could give money, but hey, look at how much money he has, and then look how much money the government has, $5 trillion or whatever the government budget is. Like, how is that money being spent? Why don't we have reporters who are going into these organizations that, and really evaluate, like, where is the bloat there? Like, how are they being run? How are they executing on their goals? How does that compare with how they used to be running? Why isn't there that same level of introspection or analysis or holding accountable, right? Because that's what they say. We got to hold these private companies accountable, like, of all this bloat, et cetera, corruption. What about the government? and you said earlier, there's this natural, like everyone just thinks government good, democracy is government. What's good for government is democracy. It's sort of these Orwellian terms.
Let me push back a little bit. Like I do think the mainstream, kind of like higher end New York Times type, Wall Street Journal, they will cover government,
but teachers union, but like I mean, to the degree
right. So there are tent poles and things that like we're not questioning from first principles. Like, do the teachers unions actually have a major impact on the educational outcomes? I love this stat. I mean, it's a sad stat, but it's just like I think it's like there are 55 schools or something in the state of Illinois that like 0 students are proficient in math, like 0, like not one smart kid. It's just 0. And like, I think a ton of them are in Chicago, $29,000 per student. There are other places in the country that have similar demographic breakdowns of students, socioeconomic, that do have at least a few kids who are proficient in math. So it's like, what is happening there? And so I don't think you do get that level of questioning from the mainstream media. But like, if there's actual real corruption, or there's, put some of the Biden stuff aside, because obviously that didn't get covered. But I do think that you get some amount of it, but it is not even close to what it is relative to corporate, one, or it tends to be probably more focused on Trump than it is, Biden. And then I think that the second point, which is the more salient, is relative to the amount of money being spent by the government, it should be way inverted, right? So it's like it should be way dialed up. Like we should be holding on a per dollar basis in terms of impact into society. We should be holding the government much more accountable than we are holding companies, because
our money.
Yeah, and look, companies are held accountable by the market, right? And so like, yes, there are some monopolies, some instances there, but for the most part, like IBM is being held accountable by the market, right? It's like there is no future for IBM. It is on a slow, decline. It's a consulting company at this point, right? That likes to claim they have patents. That is probably where I'd split it, is that I agree with Balaji in the sense that the amount of holding accountable relative to the size of the government is not happening. But to say that it's not happening at all, I would say it's probably more surface level or kind of like token than it is about like where it probably should be. But at the same time, like at this point, newspapers aren't really, they're like a mood affiliation business, right? It's like infotainment. It's, I'm mad about Trump, so I'm going to subscribe to the New York Times. Like the modern newspaper was a result of the fact that they had the distribution to your house once a day. And then they could put ads and they could put, classifieds and all these other things that were moneymakers. And in a true kind of like people pay for news, it's actually a niche. It's like a niche business, right? It's like the reason the New York Times, it's an internet publication, right? Like it actually has so much less to do with New York and more about just the fact that it is the single largest kind of left-leaning institution that has distribution, right? And all the fancy people and this is where all the Washington Post has outsized influences. Where do the people in Washington, D.C., what are they getting their information source from? They get it from the New York Times and they get it from the Washington Post, maybe a little bit of the Wall Street Journal, and then cable news. And that's why we still talk about cable news, is because like the episode of Saga, it's like being on Meet the Press matters still in D.C., whereas anyone from Silicon Valley would be like, I'd rather have 1 million Twitter followers. And this is what's interesting about Elon is Elon, what does he have now? 150 million Twitter followers, 200. Basically, it's like he gets a free advertisement on the platform every time he tweets. And so that is the modern Hearst, right? Like that is the ability to shape the narrative. Like Rupert Murdoch, parodied in Secession for being able to like kind of weigh in on the scales. It's like, would you rather have Fox News or would you rather own Twitter? Like just from a pure strategic for comms and shaping the discussion. Of course, you'd rather own Twitter. People still have a model of the media that like we're in a version of the world where you don't have like the local gumshoe reporter actually like breaking a case that often. I mean, you still probably do a little bit. Like, Massachusetts, there's this big murder case that's happening. And it's like a cover up with the Boston State Police. And so like, fine. That's actually some great reporting in terms of like this woman potentially is unfairly being treated. And you'll always have some level of that, but in terms of like true accountability to the large spending, that doesn't happen, right?
Well said. I think the last Curtis idea I'll bring up here is his claim that, and it kind of really surprised me when he said it, was his claim that a right winger is just a left winger from like 10 or 20 years ago. And if you're in your 30s, you'll realize that to be left in 2023 is different than what it meant to be left in 2016, which is different than 2012, which is different than 2008. Like Barack Obama even was against gay marriage at one point, right? Or Hillary Clinton, or even abortion too, I think. And so you think of the left and the right as kind of definitive parties over time, but in fact, the right just moves more left on so many. Like Mitt Romney is, seen as almost left wing today, and so it just changes how you think about where things are going. You can kind of like if you look back at like the Ben Shapiro of the 1950s or the 1980s or the 2000s or 2020s, like each sort of subsequent one is more left wing than the other on certain social issues. It's not 100% of the time. Things do reverse a little bit. It's not a straight hockey stick up. There's abortion. There's other certain things where there's like a track more right wing, but it's not like a perfect pendulum. Like when people say the right side of history, they actually mean something. Like and people say progress, the world progress, it means it gets left on certain social issues. And so I think the reason why that's interesting is if you want to predict the future, it's perhaps a safe prediction to say that the world will try to go left on certain issues, and the right will go alongside it.
Yeah, Curtis roots this in a concept which I think he got from, I want to say either Carlyle or, I think Carlyle is one of his favorite, writers. This kind of 19th century British intellectual. But the idea of Whig history, right? And actually, this kicked off a huge interest for me as just like understanding the history of England. We talked to Professor Mead, and he has that book God and Gold, which is fantastic. And I actually had no real exposure to English history prior to kind of being off those couple of years, but I read a bunch of stuff about that period because really understanding, and this is obviously with Dominion and Christianity, but really understanding the Anglo-Christian capitalism mentality, Puritanism, which obviously is deeply rooted in kind of like the core foundation of America. It's actually somewhat radical, and it's this kind of God and Gold is actually something that you should have an appreciation for. But Whig history specifically is this concept of the progressives will just continue to win, and they have the long-term plan and will drag everyone through history to kind of the utopia, which I never really understood that or considered it, but now you kind of see it, and you can't unsee it. It's an interesting frame because basically, and this goes back to Curtis's clear pill, his point is that, okay, you want to be right wing? Good. Like, you're just not like Chris Rufo, pick your favorite person. Doesn't matter. Like, you're going to lose. You're going to lose in the long arc of history. And which is ironic in some ways because you would think of the left, the person on the left, as being the one that everything is always this, the sky is falling, climate change, culture war issues, threat to democracy, Trump. When the reality is they're the ones that win over the long arc of history all the time. And his point is that the traditional right wing way of trying to deal with this is kind of like to stop it in place and preserve what we have, when that's just a losing strategy. It's like you actually need to be tacking in a direction and pulling people in that direction, like selling someone on a vision of the future. And I think his point is that progressives, I mean, it's built into their name, right? Progress are the apex predator of selling a vision of the future. Like they're talking about making the future better. And the classic right wing person is talking about the past. And it's like they're trying to like revert to the past. And it's just, you can't stop. The water is going to keep going downhill. I think I'm more optimistic. You can take the clear pill version of you just can't win, but it goes back to this thing we've discussed before, is if you want an alternative to the hyper-progressive woke ideology, which is the dominant kind of intellectual foundation for driving the left, at least in the United States, and the United States global empire. So therefore, it's the kind of dominant winning intellectual thing. I mean, put the Chinese and the Russians aside. If you want an alternative to that, it doesn't have to just be right wing, right? If you want to compete, if you want to be Grey Tribe, you have to paint a version of the future that gets people excited enough that they're willing to kind of bet into it. And I think it goes back to my point with Balaji is the ideas can be sound, but the retail marketing, the thing that makes it sexy, the thing that makes it cool, the things that make it high status, those are a lot harder to figure out. And progressivism is always high status, like in the last 150 years, right? So the coolest people, this is a classic Curtis thing, the coolest people were communists, right? Like and we think of communists as this thing that existed outside the US, and it's like, no, if you actually look at the 20s and 30s, like all of the intellectual circles, like the coolest people in New York, in DC or wherever, most educated, they're all communists because that was cool. And there is no cool right wing. Like it's just not. It's the right can meme, but they're not cool. And actually, there was a lot of cope because I avoid reading the comments. For the commenters, there was a lot of cope on the Vivek episode, and I don't know, maybe we tapped into his campaign, and so now you got all the groupies. But kind of like they were accusing me of being a Democrat, like a lot of all this stuff. And the reality is like I'm just trying to be to use the clear pill term. I'm just trying to objectively looking at it, and it's like. The right loses all the time. They get little mini victories, but the war is won by the left. And so if you don't like the direction the left is headed in a macro sense, is build or try to create an alternative that you think can actually win people over without having it tack in a direction you find deplorable. And I think that's possible. I think it requires someone to actually like, it's a founder, right? Like you need to actually build it. It's like building a religion or a movement, right?
And that's why I'm excited about the idea of a gray tribe, because the right is not only uncool, but it's also ideologically different from what I'm not pro-life. I'm not anti-gay marriage. I'm like, I don't want to be associated with those people either, in the same way that I want to be like affiliated with the left or identified as the left. And so there are a lot of people, most people listening to this probably, or at least a bunch of them, who feel homeless and that they don't politically homeless and that they don't identify with the major issues.
I used to be that kind of person. Oh, I'm socially liberal, fiscally conservative.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that.
No. But it's just like I know so many people who are like that because it's basically fundamentally I don't want to take a position, right? Yeah. I don't want to offend the super progressives because that hurt my career. So I'm gonna just say, yeah, you haven't even deeply thought about it. Maybe you actually care about it, but you immediately agree. Oh, I'm gonna take all the cool people's positions on social issues, so therefore I won't get canceled. Okay. On the fiscal issues, stated versus revealed preference, you probably want a lower tax rate. You do want to make more money. You want that second home or first home or whatever thing to keep up with the Joneses. And that's the PMC. And that works because those people are beaten into submission by the progressives, and they form this like Borg of a block, right? Because these are extremely competent people. These are the people you could put in a government agency or an appointment and would love the little credential status to be able to say, oh yeah, I worked in the White House, or, I worked for the U.S. Digital Service or whatever, like, thing that you can sell a PMCer. And so that is an extremely powerful block because now you've sucked even more of the elites who maybe in a prior era would have been comfortable being a Republican, right? And now it's just like to be a well-educated person in the United States. I'm sure if there's a chart, like you could get this, the number of self-identified Republicans of people graduating from top 10 universities in 1950 versus now, it'd be like, 10% versus 50% or maybe even higher. And then so in a world where that is a extremely well executed strategy, whether intentional or kind of emergent, by this kind of weird group of progressives and PMCers.
Trump handed it to them. Trump is really, and so
right, yeah, you make it so untenable to even be a Republican. You just like push even more people over, right? So my big push to people is when I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative, and I think that people know that that's stupid to say now. But even if they try to like position it, it's just like, okay, let's just call a spade. You are unwilling to take a stand on a political standpoint, and you are willing to outsource your power to the progressives, right? Like California is a function of that thing, right? So you have the highest concentration of talented people across San Francisco and LA in the country. And they basically, any of the PMCers just basically tack to this extremely dysfunctional set of progressives who run the state. And, they can't build a train. They think algebra is racist. Like all this kind of stuff is a function of And it's a rational reaction on an individual basis, right? It's like, I just want to get my career, man. Like, I just like, I want to make money. I want to get the credentials so everyone thinks that I did well. And, like, I don't want to deal with this epic fight. And so, okay. So until someone figures out how to sell the PMCers on something that isn't labeled an IST, right? Because it's like Trump or whatever, you're going to have that dysfunction.
And that is a good challenge to anyone who's saying, hey, I'm neither of these parties, which I just did, is why don't you take over one of the parties then? Why don't you convince the people in the parties to get closer to some of your positions and align it where you have shared overlap and change some of the positions so that you can have a say and, take a position, as opposed to be this third party that is going to lose because these two parties already have such critical mass and infrastructure, et cetera.
Right. And it goes back to, is I genuinely believe, never having done a political campaign, so like let me just like caveat that. My hypothesis is, if you actually wanted to do it, it is startup founder level, just you have to break the system. And the best way to do that is through technology, in my view, in the sense that you need more operating leverage, you need more coordination, and you need to figure out a way to accumulate enough talent on that core team of building whatever the infrastructure to make that happen. The app is the thing that we'll look back and someone will have figured it out, and it'll just be like, oh, that was so obvious, right? It's like people are able to coordinate on all these different private apps, but actually building an app that has a just like very clear political purpose of gaining power, and then going back to the all-time wisdom of politics is about helping your friends and hurting your enemies. Like that's what you do with this app. And you build a movement around, like, here are the set of policies that are going to help you and hurt the people you don't like. And hurt the people you don't like is a bit glib. But it's the idea is, take the people you don't like in power and get them out of power, and put people who are going to do things that you want to see in the world in power.
Yeah, this is a great critique, which is too many people focus on what they would do if they hypothetically had power, and not enough on, okay, how to actually win, how to actually have the authority to implement the version of reality that you want to do, which, if you don't want to put in the work there, then you're just sort of intellectually masturbating, or is just sort of a fruitless
exercise. And I think this is the classic line of, like, amateurs talk strategy, practitioners, generals talk tactics. Like that's the point. It's like, how do you, and this is where I give Balaji credit. He's literally talking about street by street, how do we win? And like, that is actually the level of like grind that you are going to have to go do.
Maybe let's end on this idea, which is, last night, we were talking to your wife, Julia, and she was saying how she talked to someone, who's a really smart person, but didn't have great thoughts on nuclear. And this idea of gel-man amnesia, which you had on Peter Zahan, once you heard him talk about Bitcoin, this idea that you hear someone say something dumb on something a lot about, and then you start to question everything they've been saying because you don't know a ton about this other stuff, but so you can't qualify what they've been saying. But if the thing that you know about, they've been saying dumb things, maybe they've been saying dumb things about other things. I think you can make a parallel to this idea that, like, a lot of beliefs that people have, they haven't derived from first principles. They were just kind of like foisted upon us. And we think them, we think we truly believe them, and we get mad when people discredit them. But once, you break one of those beliefs and you're like, wait, I've been thinking this my whole life and I believed it so strongly. And then someone just provided an argument that was like a quake. It just like shifted it or showed me some evidence that showed that this belief isn't true. And it's a little bit of gel-man amnesia to that too. It's like, okay, let me evaluate all these beliefs that I feel so strongly about, and let me just quick do a re-up. Let me just quickly, like, first principles, derive them again to make sure I actually believe them. Oh wait, I do actually believe this. Oh wait, this also is kind of shaky, or at the very least, it's a bit more nuanced. And so hopefully, what these thinkers do, even if you disagree with them on most things, is just challenge your opinions to make sure that you're deriving them from first principles from the ground up, as opposed to unquestioningly.
I think that was the single most important thing getting exposed to Curtis did for me, is not, I want to now go parrot everything Curtis says. Like, no. Do I think that there are a lot of very interesting ideas there that I spend time thinking about? Yes. Is it made me want to be smarter And I think we talked about this in an early episode of like, I wanted to go more upstream. I wanted to understand, like, when you read unqualified reservations, especially online, and you have all the links to Wikipedia, it's like, damn, like how does like one person, whether it's right or wrong, pull all these references in and like be able to think about it? And it's like, I've never considered like the political ramifications of a country like South Africa and the apartheid. And I just took it at face value of like, apartheid bad, like, of course, we should be getting rid of it. And I'm not arguing for that, by the way. It's just the point of never questioning anything and wanting to actually get first principles and primary sources. And so I think the thing from that with Curtis is just like, I need to do the work. I need to get smarter so that whenever I can have a conversation about anything that I'm trying to talk about in the world, I feel like I have 3 or 4 or 5 clicks up, and I can, in the same way that you go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole, you click the word and you click the word and you click the word and you end up on philosophy. The whole point is like, can you do that for most topics that you have a strongly held belief or just a point of view on, right? It's like, what should our crime policy be? Like, how many clicks can you go? And I'm not even claiming that I've done all the work there. Like, it's a motivating thing of like, it's the classic, like, you think you know a lot, and then as soon as you actually start to learn, you drop down to the beginner's mindset of like, there's so much that I don't know. And I think that if I could take anything from that experience is, I haven't had the time yet, and I look forward to the day that I can go do that when that's the right time, to develop a first principles view of the world that is, I feel really strong about in terms of like, if I go toe to toe with anybody in terms of their ability to question it, because I've spent the time, tried to read the perspectives, tried to model it in a way that is rooted in as much primary source, which obviously still has its own bias if you're dealing with history, as possible.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is separate the person from the idea. I almost wish we had a different name than Curtis to talk about these collection of ideas, because a very mid thing that people will do is say, hey, this person once said this dumb thing or did a bunch of dumb things. How can we even consider that there might be something of value to their other work? And if we ascribe that same sort of litmus test to so many of the people who brought us the inventions of modern intellectual thought, we would discredit so much of what we hold valuable today. And so there's just a need to separate the person from the ideas and evaluate them on their own merits.
Yeah, I mean, I view that usually as a cheap intellectual tactic, like by someone who's actually afraid of confronting the ideas because it might actually reveal a truth that they're not comfortable with because they have a preconceived narrative. So the easiest way is to attack the root. It's not even the root, because it's a surface level attack of trying to cancel you for idea association. It's just like, we're not even going to talk about the idea over here on its independent merits. We're going to talk about a separate idea that this person has proposed that gives me a lot of high ground in a way of like, anytime you can call someone a Nazi, it's like, I've defeated this line of inquiry. We can go back to the fantasy that I had constructed before. And so I think like what I've really appreciated having this podcast is just an outlet to be able to kind of talk about this stuff, because now I actually feel very comfortable in that, like, I just don't know that many things. Like, it's just like, I'm trying to figure out the world.
Yeah, we're amateurs. We're figuring it out.
Yeah, right. And so it's just sharing how we're experiencing things. And in that way, it's very freeing versus feeling repressed and being like, you can't talk about like, wow, the world is a complex place. I wonder how we can get to some higher order amount of truth in our understanding of it.
Yeah. And we get smarter too, because listeners have feedback, they have questions. So yeah, we always welcome DMs, thoughts, comments, what you want to hear more of. But yeah, let's wrap on that. This has been great. Until next time.
Later, dude.
Turpentine is a network of podcasts, newsletters, and more, covering tech, business, and culture, all from the perspective of industry insiders and experts. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from AI with Cognitive Revolution to Econ 102 with Noah Smith. Our other shows drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, and investors, like Moment of Zen and my show Upstream. We're looking for industry-leading hosts and shows, along with sponsors. If you think that might be you or your company, email me at eric@turpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co.